Before she was a queen, before she was a scandal, and long before she became a myth, Anne Boleyn was simply a young woman from a noble family in Kent. Born around 1501, likely at Hever Castle, she entered the world at a time when England's nobility measured power not by personal ambition, but by the alliances forged through marriage. Anne's early life, however, would set her apart from the beginning. As a child, she was sent abroad, first to the Netherlands to serve at the court of Margaret of Austria, and then to France, where she joined the household of Queen Claude. These years transformed her. In the polished, cultured atmosphere of European courts, she absorbed languages, learned graceful manners, and developed a refined sense of style. The French influence would stay with her forever, from her daring fashion choices to the sophistication of her conversation. By the time she returned to England in her early 20s, Anne was not just another court lady. She had a presence. She knew how to capture attention, not merely with beauty, though she had that, but with wit, charm, and an ability to keep a man's interest through clever, teasing conversation. This was unusual in Henry VIII's court, where women were often expected to be silent ornaments. Anne's arrival coincided with the reign of Queen Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife. She initially served Catherine as a lady-in-waiting, but her destiny shifted when she caught the king's eye. Henry had already had romantic encounters with noblewomen, but something about Anne was different. She was ambitious, she understood her value, and she refused to be treated as just another fleeting affair. Her refusal was bold. She would not surrender herself unless Henry made her queen. For a woman of her time, this was not only daring, it was dangerous. Henry was a man used to getting what he wanted, and challenging him could have been the end of her prospects, but instead, her resistance seemed to inflame his interest. Years of courtship followed, and their relationship became a public obsession. It also became a political issue, because Henry was still married to Catherine. Divorce, at the time, required the Pope's approval, and Henry's request was denied. But instead of giving up Anne, Henry began to consider the unthinkable, breaking with the Catholic Church itself. By the late 1520s, the King's Great Matter, as it was called, had divided England. To marry Anne, Henry sought to annul his marriage to Catherine without the Pope's consent. This set in motion a chain of events that would tear England from Rome's authority and give rise to the Church of England. Anne, meanwhile, was caught in the center of a political storm. Every step she took in public was watched. Every glance from the king was noted. Her critics called her a temptress, accusing her of luring Henry away from his lawful wife. Her supporters saw her as a woman of rare intelligence who could match Henry's fiery temper and ambition. By holding out for a crown, Anne Boleyn had defied convention, reshaped royal politics, and set herself on a path from which there was no return. She was no longer simply a noblewoman from Kent. She was the future Queen of England. But in the Tudor court, a crown could be as dangerous as it was dazzling, and the higher Anne rose, the more powerful her enemies became.
The year was 1533. After years of pursuit, frustration, and defiance, Henry VIII had done what no English king had dared before. He defied the Pope. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon was declared invalid by his own archbishop, and in a private ceremony, he wed Anne Boleyn. It was a victory not just for Henry's personal desires, but for Anne's steadfast refusal to accept anything less than a crown. The cost, however, was enormous. England's break from the Catholic Church fractured centuries of religious unity. The Pope excommunicated Henry, and loyal Catholics across Europe condemned him. In England itself, the shift was seismic. Those who had prospered under Catherine now found themselves sidelined, and those who supported Anne gained unprecedented influence. Anne had become not only a queen, but the living symbol of this religious and political revolution. Her coronation in June was a spectacle designed to impress and to silence doubt. The streets of London filled with processions, tapestries, and cheering crowds. Anne rode through the city beneath a canopy of cloth of gold, wearing a gown that shimmered like the dawn. At Westminster Abbey, she was crowned with ancient ceremonial pomp. But behind the smiles and celebration, there were whispers. Some bowed from loyalty, others from necessity, but many in the crowd still saw Catherine as the rightful queen. Just months later, in September, Anne gave birth to her first child. Henry had staked everything on this moment: his marriage, his crown, even his soul. But when the baby was placed in his arms, he saw not the son he longed for, but a daughter, Elizabeth. Henry's disappointment was immediate, though he tried to mask it with a public show of joy. Anne, for her part, was fiercely devoted to her child. She believed another pregnancy would soon follow, and that she would still give Henry his longed-for heir. For a brief time, Anne enjoyed the height of her power. She influenced royal appointments, promoted her allies, and advanced her family's fortunes. Her sharp tongue and quick temper were well known, and she was unafraid to challenge Henry's opinions in private, something that both fascinated and frustrated him. She was not a silent consort. She was a partner, an advisor, and at times a political actor in her own right. But every crown comes with a shadow. For those who had lost power because of her rise, Anne was an obstacle to be removed. Former allies of Catherine of Aragon nurtured their resentment. Devout Catholics prayed for her downfall. Even some of Henry's closest courtiers began to wonder if the queen who had helped him change the face of England might one day become too powerful. Anne's position was also undermined by tragedy. Several pregnancies ended in miscarriage, each one chipping away at Henry's confidence in their marriage. The more time passed without a male heir, the more vulnerable she became. The court, always a nest of ambition and rivalry, began to shift its loyalties. And quietly, in the background, a new name began to surface: Jane Seymour, a lady-in-waiting whose gentle demeanor was everything Anne's critics wished she would be. For now, Anne remained queen, but her grip on that title was not as firm as it appeared. The very qualities that had carried her to the throne, her intelligence, her independence, her refusal to yield, were the same traits that made her dangerous in the eyes of her enemies. And in Tudor England, danger rarely went unpunished. Anne had helped Henry change a kingdom, but the kingdom would soon turn against her.
Power is never held without cost, and by the mid-1530s, Anne Boleyn's crown had become as heavy as it was glittering. She had been the woman Henry defied the Pope for, the queen who had reshaped England's religion and politics. But with each passing month, the glow of her triumph began to fade. Her sharp intelligence and quick temper, qualities that once enchanted Henry, now stirred unease among his advisers. Anne was outspoken, and in the intimate chambers of court, she did not hesitate to challenge the king's decisions. Some saw this as bold and admirable, others as dangerous defiance. In a court built on hierarchy and obedience, a queen who spoke too freely could become a threat. Beyond the walls of the palace, resentment brewed. Supporters of Catherine of Aragon still considered Anne an interloper, her marriage to Henry a scandal, and her daughter Elizabeth a usurper in waiting. Devout Catholics, in England and abroad, blamed Anne for the religious upheaval that had torn the country from Rome's authority. To them, she was not a legitimate queen, but a symbol of heresy and disorder. It was in this climate that the first whispers began to circulate.
whispers that would grow into the myths we remember today. Some claimed Anne was marked by nature itself, born with a sixth finger on one hand. Others spoke of a strange growth beneath her clothing, a blemish hidden from public view. In an age when superstition was woven into daily life, such marks could be interpreted as signs of witchcraft or divine disfavor. The stories did not stop there. Enemies whispered that she had used sorcery to ensnare Henry's affections, that no natural woman could have made a king abandon a decades-long marriage. The reality, however, is telling. None of these allegations appear in accounts from those who saw Anne daily during her reign. They surfaced only after her arrest, carefully crafted to strip her of dignity and paint her as a danger to both king and country. But myths, once born, have a way of taking root. They traveled through the court like smoke, curling into the ears of those who wished to believe them. The idea of the six-fingered witch served a purpose. It made Anne's downfall seem not only politically necessary, but morally righteous. Meanwhile, Anne faced struggles closer to home. She had suffered multiple miscarriages, each one deepening Henry's fear that their marriage would not produce a son. The king, once her greatest champion, began to show signs of frustration, even withdrawal. His gaze turned more often toward Jane Seymour, a quiet, compliant lady-in-waiting whose gentle manners were the perfect contrast to Anne's fiery spirit. The court became a battlefield of alliances and betrayals. Every smile could mask an ambition. Every bow could hide a dagger. Courtiers who once vied for Anne's favor began to edge away, aligning themselves with her rivals. She was still queen, but the foundations of her reign were cracking. Anne had risen higher than most could imagine, but in the Tudor world, the climb to power was rarely matched by an equal stay at the top. And when the winds shifted, they did so without warning, carrying with them not only the threat of political ruin, but the full weight of the lies that would define her for centuries to come.
By the spring of 1536, the tide had fully turned against Anne Boleyn. She had been queen for just 3 years, but in Henry's court, power could rise and fall in the span of a heartbeat. Where once the king's eyes had followed her with devotion, now they lingered on another, Jane Seymour, the quiet and dutiful lady-in-waiting whose very demeanor seemed crafted to soothe Henry's growing discontent. Anne's miscarriages had deepened the king's fear that she would never give him a son. In an age when a male heir was the cornerstone of dynastic security, this was more than disappointment. It was a political crisis. Henry, who had risked everything to make her his queen, began to see her not as the key to his legacy, but as a dangerous obstacle to it. In early May, the blow fell. Anne was arrested and taken to the Tower of London. The charges were sensational: adultery with multiple men, plotting the king's death, and even an accusation involving her own brother, George Boleyn. The list of alleged lovers included courtiers, musicians, and friends, men whose lives would soon be destroyed alongside hers. The speed of events was staggering. Interrogations were carried out in haste, confessions extracted under pressure, and witnesses offered testimonies riddled with inconsistencies. Historians now agree these charges were politically motivated, designed not to uncover truth, but to remove Anne with minimal resistance. For Henry, the path was clear. To marry Jane Seymour, Anne had to be gone. Her trial was held in the Tower itself. Anne faced a jury of noblemen, many of whom had reasons, political or personal, to see her condemned. She defended herself with eloquence, denying every accusation, but the verdict had been decided before she ever entered the hall. The sentence was death.
From her prison cell in the Queen's lodgings, Anne prepared for the end. She did not plead for mercy. Instead, she spoke of her innocence, prayed for the king, and entrusted her daughter, Elizabeth, to God's protection. Visitors noted her composure, her almost unnatural calm in the face of death. Perhaps she knew that her fate was sealed the moment she entered the Tower. On May 17, 2 days before her scheduled execution, her brother George and the other accused men were put to death. The following day, Anne's scheduled execution was postponed. Henry had ordered a swordsman from France, a more precise and less painful method than the traditional axe. It was, in a way, a final gesture of favor from a king who no longer loved her. The delay gave Anne 2 more nights to contemplate the end. She spoke to her attendants, shared moments of humor, and reflected on the strange twists of fortune that had carried her from Hever Castle to the throne and now to the scaffold. She faced it not with fear, but with the dignity of a woman who understood that her story had already been written by others. In the Tudor court, no fall was ever gentle, and Anne's would be one of the most dramatic in English history. She had entered the Tower as a queen. She would leave it only once more, on the morning of her death.
Morning broke cold and pale on May 19, 1536. Within the walls of the Tower of London, Anne Boleyn dressed for the last time. She chose a dark gown with a mantle of ermine, the fur traditionally worn by queens, as if to remind those who would watch her die that she had once been England's crowned consort. Beneath her cap, her long hair was tucked away, the executioner's sword requiring nothing to obstruct its swift path. The scaffold stood within the Tower's inner ward, surrounded by a small crowd, officials, guards, and a scattering of privileged witnesses. No throngs of commoners were allowed. This was to be a controlled, almost private affair, free from the unpredictable passions of the London streets. Anne ascended the steps with measured grace. Her face, observers said, was calm, almost serene. She addressed those gathered, speaking not of revenge or injustice, but of loyalty. She praised the king, declaring him a gentle and sovereign lord, and asked God to preserve him. She made no protest of innocence, for in Tudor England such words would have been seen as defiance. Instead, she offered prayers for her accusers, and in doing so, held tightly to the dignity that had been denied her in life's final weeks. The French swordsman, brought especially for this execution, stood ready. His presence was a final, curious mercy, Henry's choice to avoid the English axe, whose blows could be brutal and imprecise. The swordsman approached from behind, following the French custom, so that Anne would not see the moment of the strike. A single command, a swift movement, and the woman who had been queen was gone. Her body was placed in an arrow chest. There had been no coffin prepared, and buried in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, within the Tower's walls. The grave was unmarked, a quiet resting place for a life that once commanded the attention of a kingdom. But death did not silence Anne Boleyn. In the years that followed, stories of her life and death were retold, reshaped, and embroidered with lies. The myth of the six-fingered witch became one of the most enduring, a symbol of supposed unnaturalness used to justify her downfall. To her enemies, she remained a seductress and a usurper. To others, she was a martyr to ambition and male treachery. Her greatest legacy, however, was not in the myths, but in her bloodline. Her daughter, Elizabeth, was just 2 years old when her mother was executed.
Against all odds, Elizabeth would ascend the throne in 1558 and reign for 45 years, presiding over an era of exploration, cultural flourishing, and national strength. The golden age of Elizabeth I was, in many ways, the final vindication of Anne's life, a reminder that her story was not simply one of downfall, but of enduring influence. In the centuries since, Anne Boleyn has been remembered in 100 different ways: schemer, saint, victim, villain. But the truth is more complex than any single version. She was a woman who navigated the treacherous currents of Tudor politics with intelligence and determination, who reached the highest place a subject could dream of, and who paid for it with her life. Anne's real crime, perhaps, was to stand too boldly in a world that feared women with power. And though the myths of witchcraft and deformity have long been debunked, they serve as a reminder of how easily truth can be buried beneath the needs of those who write history.